The telegram crumpled in Cordelia's gloved hand as the 4:15 train pulled away in a cloud of black smoke, leaving her standing alone on the wooden platform for the third day running. Her burgundy traveling dress, once pristine, now bore the dust of 3 dawns and the weight of 3 disappointments. "He ain't coming, miss." She spun around to find a boy of perhaps 7 years, his copper hair wild beneath a battered hat, his feet encased in boots far too large for his small frame. He clutched a fishing pole in one dirt-streaked hand and regarded her with eyes the color of summer storms. "I beg your pardon?" Cordelia's voice carried the refined accent of Boston finishing schools, though it trembled slightly. "Mr. Beauregard Whitlock," the child said matter-of-factly, pronouncing each syllable with exaggerated care. "That's who you're waiting for, ain't it? Saw you yesterday with his picture. And the day before that." Heat flooded Cordelia's cheeks. 3 days ago, she'd stepped off the eastbound train with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a promise letter from a man she'd never met, a promise that seemed as substantial as morning mist now. "How do you know about Mr. Whitlock?" she asked, though something in the boy's knowing gaze already provided the answer. "On account of he's been dead near on 2 months now." The boy shifted his fishing pole to his other hand. "Took sick with the fever. Died before your letter ever reached town." The platform seemed to tilt beneath Cordelia's feet. She gripped the rough-hewn railing, splinters catching at her kid gloves. That's impossible. I received correspondence just 6 weeks ago. That'd be on account of my daddy." The boy kicked at a loose board with his oversized boot. "He's been answering Mr. Whitlock's mail ever since he passed. Didn't have the heart to tell folks the truth, seeing as how Mr. Whitlock owed most everyone in town money." Cordelia stared at this small bearer of devastating news. Behind him, the dusty main street of Willowbrook stretched like a thread between ramshackle buildings, their false fronts peeling paint in the harsh afternoon sun. A few curious townspeople had gathered near the general store, watching the drama unfold at their humble depot. "Your father has been impersonating a dead man?" "Daddy says it ain't impersonating if you're trying to help folks. Says Mr. Whitlock would have wanted his death settled proper." The boy's chin jutted out defensively. "Besides, Daddy's got real nice handwriting. Learned it from his mama before she died." A laugh escaped Cordelia's throat, not from humor, but from the sheer impossibility of her situation. She'd sold everything she owned in Boston, burned every bridge with her disapproving family, all for the promise of marriage to a man who existed only in carefully penned letters. "What's your name, child?" "Jasper Crenshaw," he said proudly. "And I got a proposition for you, Miss ... Miss Cordelia Ashworth." "Well, Miss Cordelia Ashworth." Jasper planted his feet wide and looked her square in the eye. "Seeing as how you came all this way expecting to get married, and seeing as how my daddy's been working real hard to keep Mr. Whitlock's good name intact, maybe you ought to consider marrying Daddy instead." Cordelia's mouth fell open as the audacity of the proposal settled over her like dust from the departing train. Around them, the late afternoon heat shimmered off the weathered platform boards, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 5 times. "I beg your pardon, young man, but I cannot simply marry someone I've never met based on the recommendation of a child." Jasper's storm-gray eyes twinkled with mischief. "Well, you never met Mr. Whitlock neither, and you were fixing to marry him." The logic, however flawed, struck her speechless. She pressed a hand to her temple, feeling the beginning of what promised to be a thunderous headache. 3 days of sleeping in the station's uncomfortable wooden chairs, surviving on crackers, and lukewarm coffee from the depot's lunch counter had left her both physically and emotionally drained. "Besides," Jasper continued, warming to his subject, "Daddy's a sight better looking than Mr. Whitlock ever was, and he's got all his teeth." "Jasper, Obadiah Crenshaw, what in tarnation are you telling this poor woman?" The voice carried across the platform like summer thunder, rich and deep with just a hint of the South softening its edges. Cordelia turned to see a man striding toward them, his long legs covering the distance from the main street in what seemed like 3 strides. Where his sun was copper and storm clouds, Jasper's father was golden wheat and summer sky. His hair caught the late sunlight, and his eyes, those same storm gray eyes his son had inherited, fixed on Cordelia with an expression caught between mortification and curiosity. "Daddy, this here's Miss Cordelia Ashworth. She came to marry Mr. Whitlock, only I already told her about him being dead and all." "Jasper." The man's voice carried a warning note. "We discussed this." "I know we did. And you said Mr. Whitlock was a fool to let a woman like this slip through his fingers." "Well, seems to me he ain't got fingers anymore, so maybe you ought to step up." Cordelia found herself caught between horror and an inappropriate urge to laugh. The man Jasper's father removed his worn felt hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of long practice dealing with his precocious son. "Miss Ashworth, I'm Micah Crenshaw, and I owe you the deepest apology. I should have written to tell you about Beau's passing the moment I learned you were coming." His voice held genuine remorse, and when he looked at her directly, Cordelia felt something unexpected flutter in her chest. This was not at all how she'd imagined meeting her husband to be, standing on a dusty platform in a town she'd never heard of until 6 weeks ago. "Mr. Crenshaw, I'm afraid I don't understand. Why were you answering Mr. Whitlock's correspondence?" Micah's jaw worked silently for a moment, and he glanced at his son before answering. "Beau owed money to half the merchants in town. When he took sick, he asked me to look after his affairs. That included—" He gestured vaguely at the telegram still clutched in her hand. "Well, that included you. So you've been writing to me for weeks, pretending to be another man?" "I never signed his name to nothing," Micah said quickly. "I just didn't correct certain assumptions." Jasper tugged at his father's sleeve. "Tell her about the letters." "Daddy, tell her how you said Mr. Whitlock was lucky to have found such a fine woman, and how any man worth his salt would move heaven and earth to deserve her." Cordelia's breath caught. Those words, written in careful script on cream-colored paper, had been what finally convinced her to leave Boston. They had seemed too heartfelt, too genuine to come from a stranger seeking only a convenient arrangement. "You wrote those words?" she asked softly. Micah's ears turned red. "I may have gotten carried away." The evening shadow stretched long across the platform as the 3 of them stood in awkward silence. Cordelia studied Micah Crenshaw's face, searching for traces of deception or calculation, but found only honest embarrassment and something that might have been hope. "Miss Ashworth," Micah said finally, settling his hat back on his head, "I've got a small house just outside town. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and there's a spare room. You're welcome to stay while you figure out your next step. No charge, of course. It's the least I can do after." "Well, after this whole muddle," Jasper bounced on his toes. "And we got chickens, real good layers. Daddy makes the best flapjacks this side of the Mississippi, too." "Jasper," Micah warned. Though his tone was gentle, Cordelia looked down at her rumpled traveling dress, felt the weight of her nearly empty purse, and faced the stark reality of her situation. She had exactly enough money for either a train ticket back to Boston, where her stern Aunt Prudence would receive her with a chorus of "I told you so," or a week's lodging at whatever passed for a hotel in this dusty settlement. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Crenshaw, but I couldn't impose." "Ain't no imposition," Jasper piped up. "Daddy gets lonely, and I've been wanting a mama something fierce." Jasper Obadiah. The boy's ears turned as red as his father's, but he jutted out his chin defiantly. "Well, it's true. Ever since Mama died birthing me, it's been just us 2. And you're always saying how a boy needs a woman's influence to grow up proper. Cordelia's heart clenched at the matter-of-fact way the child spoke of his mother's death, of growing up without feminine guidance. She looked at Micah and saw the same pain flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "Both of you," Micah nodded, his throat working. "Thank you. It's been ... it's been just the two of us for quite a while now." A warm breeze stirred the dust around their feet, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the distant aroma of someone's dinner cooking. Cordelia realized that the platform had cleared of curious onlookers, leaving them alone with the weight of impossible circumstances and uncertain futures. "Mr. Crenshaw, might I ask you something?" "Of course." "In your letters, Mr. Whitlock's letters, you wrote about wanting a partnership, not just a marriage of convenience. You spoke of shared dreams and building something lasting together." "Did you mean those words?" Micah's gaze met hers directly, and she saw no subterfuge there, only raw honesty. "Every word, Miss Ashworth. I may have been writing for a dead man, but those were my thoughts, my hopes. Beau was looking for a housekeeper and someone to tend his store. I was," he paused, glancing at his son. "I was looking for something more." "What kind of something more?" "A partner, a companion. Someone who'd see past this dusty town and help build something better. Someone who'd love my boy like her own." Jasper tugged at Cordelia's skirt. "He's been practicing dancing, Miss Cordelia. Out in a barn where he thinks I can't see. Steps on his own feet something awful, but he's been practicing." Despite everything, the deception, the confusion, the impossible situation, Cordelia found herself smiling. There was something utterly endearing about the image of this serious man attempting to waltz with shadows in a hay-strewn barn. "I see." She looked between father and son, these two lonely souls who had somehow stumbled into her life at the moment when she most needed stumbling into. "And what would you expect from such a partner, Mr. Crenshaw?" "Honesty," he said immediately. "No more deceptions, no more half-truths. If we're to build something together, it has to be built on truth." "And love?" she asked quietly. "That's something that grows, I reckon. Like anything worth having. But it needs proper ground to take root." Jasper looked between them with the shrewd expression of a child who sensed important adult conversations happening just beyond his understanding. "Does this mean you're going to marry Daddy?" "Jasper..." But Cordelia surprised them both by laughing a real laugh this time, not the bitter sound that had escaped her earlier. "Young man, your father hasn't asked me yet." The next morning dawned clear and bright, washing the dusty streets of Willowbrook in golden light that made even the most ramshackle buildings look almost charming. Cordelia woke in a narrow but comfortable bed in the Crenshaw house, having slept it better than she had in months. Through the thin walls, she could hear Micah moving around the kitchen, the soft murmur of his voice as he spoke to Jasper, the sizzle of something cooking on the stove. The domestic sounds tugged at something deep in her chest, a longing she'd kept carefully buried beneath years of proper Boston deportment. When she emerged from the spare room, dressed once again in her burgundy traveling dress, now thoroughly brushed and mended where the platform splinters had caught it, she found Micah standing at the stove, his back to her as he worked. Jasper sat at a rough-hewn table, his copper hair slicked down with water, his two large boots swinging freely from the chair. "Morning, Miss Cordelia," Jasper called cheerfully. "Daddy made extra flapjacks on account of you being company." Micah turned, and Cordelia felt that same flutter in her chest she'd experienced the day before. In the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, his golden hair caught the sun, and his eyes seemed even more striking against his tanned skin. "I hope you slept well," he said, wiping his hands on a flour sack towel. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." "Thank you." She accepted the chipped ceramic mug he offered, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate blends she'd grown accustomed to in Boston, but it tasted real in a way that expensive coffee never had. As they ate breakfast, Jasper proved correct about his father's skill with flapjacks. Cordelia found herself studying these two people who had so unexpectedly entered her life. Micah moved with quiet efficiency, anticipating his son's needs almost before the boy expressed them. He cut Jasper's flapjacks into neat squares, refilled his milk without being asked, and gently reminded him to use his napkin instead of his sleeve. "Tell me about your work, Mr. Crenshaw," she said. "What is it you do here in Willowbrook?" "I run the livery stable," he said, pouring syrup onto his own plate. "Take care of folks' horses, rent out wagons for those who need them. It's not much, but it's honest work." "And profitable?" His ears colored slightly. "We get by. Jasper's got shoes and food, and we've got a roof that doesn't leak too badly when it rains." Jasper piped up, "Daddy's real good with horses. Even mean old Mr. Hutchinson's stallion minds him, and that horse has kicked near everyone else in town." "Jasper," Micah warned, but there was pride in his voice. Cordelia found herself thinking of the letters again, those careful, thoughtful words about building something lasting. "In your correspondence, you mentioned dreams of expanding. What did you have in mind?" Micah set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Willowbrook's growing. More families coming through every month, heading west or deciding to settle here. They need more than just a place to stable their horses. They need supplies, equipment, someone who understands what they're facing. A general store, eventually, and maybe a proper hotel instead of that boarding house with the leaky roof. This town could be something special, Miss Ashworth, with the right kind of vision and hard work." The way he spoke, with quiet passion and careful planning, reminded Cordelia of her father's business discussions at the dinner table years ago. But where her father had always talked about money and profit margins, Micah spoke about community and helping people build better lives. "That requires capital," she said practically. "Yes, it does." He met her gaze directly. "I've been saving, putting aside what I can. It's not much yet, but it's a start." "Yes." Jasper looked between them with growing excitement. "Are you going to be our business partner, Miss Cordelia? Daddy says a good partner is worth more than all the money in the bank." Cordelia smiled at the boy, then looked at his father. "Mr. Crenshaw, might I ask you to show me around town today? I'd like to see what you see when you talk about Willowbrook's potential." Micah's face lit up with something that made him look years younger. "I'd be honored to, Miss Ashworth." As they prepared to leave, Jasper tugging on his oversized boots and chattering about all the places they should visit, Cordelia caught sight of herself in the small mirror by the door. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the proper Boston lady who had stepped off the train 3 days ago. Her hair was looser, her cheeks had color from the prairie sun, and her eyes held a light that had been missing for months. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like she might be exactly where she was meant to be. The tour of Willowbrook revealed a town caught between past and future, its weathered buildings and dusty streets holding the promise of something greater. Micah pointed out empty lots where new businesses could flourish, explained the patterns of migration that brought families through town, and spoke with quiet authority about the region's potential for growth. The railroad's talking about extending. The line through here, he explained as they stood at the edge of town, looking out over the rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon. If that happens, Willowbrook won't be just a stopping point anymore. It'll be a destination. Cordelia shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to envision the bustling community he described. "And you believe that's really going to happen?" "I've seen the survey markers. Railroad men don't plant those unless they're serious." He pointed to a distant rise where the prairie grass grew in unnaturally straight lines. "The question isn't whether it'll happen, but whether we'll be ready when it does." Jasper, who had been remarkably patient during their business discussions, finally gave in to boyish impulses and began chasing grasshoppers through the tall grass. His laughter carried on the warm breeze, and Cordelia found herself smiling at his uninhibited joy. "He's a wonderful boy," she said softly. "He is." Micah's voice carried a note of fierce pride and protective love. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm raising him right, though." "A boy needs a mother's influence," Cordelia finished gently. "Someone to teach him things I don't know how to teach. How to be gentle when gentleness is called for. How to see the world through kinder eyes than mine." They walked back toward town as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the prairie grass gold and casting long shadows across the dusty streets. As they passed the general store, the church, the small schoolhouse, Cordelia found herself imagining what each building could become with vision and investment. "Miss Cordelia," Jasper said, skipping alongside them, "Daddy's been teaching me to read real good. Want to hear?" Before either adult could respond, the boy launched into enthusiastic recitation of a passage from what sounded like Robinson Crusoe, his small voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Several townspeople paused in their activities to listen, and Cordelia noticed the fond looks they gave the boy and the respectful nods they offered his father. "That's wonderful, Jasper," she said when he finished. "Your father is an excellent teacher." "Mama started teaching him before she died," Micah said quietly. "I just tried to keep going where she left off." As they reached the livery stable, Cordelia could hear horses moving in their stalls, the soft sounds of animals settling for the night. The familiar smells of hay and leather brought back memories of her childhood visits to her grandfather's farm, before propriety and expectations had narrowed her world to drawing rooms and tea parties. "Miss Ashworth," Micah said as they paused outside the stable doors, "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Of course. What were you running from in Boston?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She'd grown so accustomed to the polite deflections of proper society that she'd almost forgotten how refreshing honesty could be. "My family's expectations," she said finally. "My aunt wanted me to marry her business partner's son, a man twice my age who collected rare books and had no interest in anything beyond his own comfort." "And you didn't want that?" "I wanted what you wrote about in those letters, a partnership. Someone who would see me as more than just a well-bred ornament for their parlor." Micah nodded slowly. "And now? What do you want now?" Cordelia looked around at the simple buildings of Willowbrook, at Jasper chasing fireflies that were just beginning to blink in the gathering dusk, at the man beside her who had shown her more genuine respect in 2 days than she'd received in years of Boston society. "I want to build something meaningful," she said. "I want to be part of something that matters, even if it means staying in a dusty prairie town with a widowed blacksmith and his boy." "I'm not a blacksmith," Micah corrected with a smile. "I just run the livery stable." She laughed, surprised by his gentle teasing. "Even if it means staying with the livery stable owner and his remarkable son." Jasper, who had been pretending not to listen while stalking fireflies, suddenly whooped with joy. "Does that mean you're staying? Does that mean you're going to marry Daddy?" Cordelia and Micah looked at each other across the gathering darkness, and she saw her own hopes and uncertainties reflected in his storm-gray eyes. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether your father is actually asking." Micah Crenshaw had faced down angry horses, negotiated with stubborn customers, and raised a spirited boy single-handedly, but standing in front of Cordelia Ashworth as the first stars appeared over Willowbrook, he felt as nervous as a schoolboy at his first dance. "Miss Ashworth," he began, then stopped and removed his hat, running his free hand through his hair. "Cordelia." "May I call you Cordelia?" "I wish you would, Cordelia." Her name felt right on his tongue, like something he'd been waiting to say his whole life. I know this isn't how these things are usually done. I know you came here expecting to marry another man, and I know I've got no right to ask what I'm about to ask." Jasper had abandoned his firefly hunting and crept closer, his small face earnest in the lamplight spilling from the stable. Around them, the sounds of evening settled over the town dogs barking in the distance, the murmur of voices from open windows, the gentle creak of settling wood. "But I'm asking anyway," Micah continued, his voice growing stronger. "Not because it's convenient, and not because you need somewhere to go, but because these past 2 days have shown me something I didn't dare hope for." "What's that?" Cordelia's voice was barely above a whisper. "That maybe what I wrote in those letters wasn't just wishful thinking. Maybe there really could be a partnership between us, something built on respect and shared dreams, and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "And maybe love, given time to grow." Cordelia's eyes sparkled with unshed tears, though whether they were happy or sad tears, Micah couldn't tell. The uncertainty was killing him. "I don't have much to offer," he pressed on. "A small house, a business that's barely getting by, and a boy who needs more attention than any 7-year-old has a right to need. But I can promise you honesty. I can promise you respect. And I can promise you that if you'll take a chance on us, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that chance." Jasper couldn't contain himself any longer. "And I promise I'll be the best son you ever saw, Miss Cordelia. I'll mind my manners and help with chores and everything." Despite the tears now freely flowing down her cheeks, Cordelia laughed. "Oh, Jasper, you're already the best son I could imagine." She looked at Micah, seeing in his face the same vulnerability she felt in her own heart. "You want honesty? Here's honesty. I'm terrified. I left everything I knew to come here, and it turned out to be based on a lie. But somehow, the truth turned out to be better than the lie ever could have been. Does that mean—" Micah's voice caught. "It means yes, Micah Crenshaw. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll be partners with you in business and in life. And yes, I'll love that remarkable boy of yours like my own." Jasper let out a whoop that probably woke half the town and launched himself at Cordelia, wrapping his small arms around her waist with fierce joy. She caught him, holding him tight as she looked over his copper head at the man who had just asked her to share his life. "There's one more thing," Micah said, stepping closer. "I wrote in those letters about wanting to build something lasting. I meant it. This isn't about solving immediate problems or filling immediate needs. This is about choosing each other, every day, for all the days to come." "I know," Cordelia said softly. "I'm choosing you too." When Micah leaned down to kiss her, their first kiss, gentle and careful and full of promise, Jasper made exaggerated gagging sounds that sent them both into laughter. The boy's delight was infectious, and soon all three of them were laughing. Under the star-filled prairie sky. "When can we have the wedding?" Jasper demanded. "Tomorrow? Can we have it tomorrow?" "These things take time to arrange properly," Cordelia said, though she found herself wanting the same immediacy the child did. "How much time?" Micah asked, and there was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. "Well," she said, pretending to consider carefully, "I suppose if we're being practical about it, there's no reason to wait very long. I am, after all, already here, and I did come prepared to get married. Next Sunday?" he suggested hopefully. "Next Sunday sounds perfect." As they walked back to the house together, Jasper racing ahead to announce the news to the chickens of all things, Cordelia marveled at the turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been a desperate woman waiting for a stranger. Now she was engaged to marry a man she was already half in love with, and preparing to become mother to a boy who had captured her heart completely. "No regrets?" Micah asked quietly as they reached the front porch. Cordelia looked back toward the train station where this unlikely romance had begun. then at the man beside her and the child now trying to convince the chickens that they were about to have a new mama. None whatsoever, she said, and meant it with all her heart. The wedding of Micah Crenshaw and Cordelia Ashworth took place on a Sunday morning in late September, when the prairie air carried the first hint of autumn, and the wildflowers bloomed in glorious profusion along the roadside. Nearly the entire population of Willowbrook crowded into the small church, drawn as much by curiosity about the mysterious lady from Boston as by genuine goodwill. Cordelia wore her mother's pearls, and a dress she'd fashioned from blue silk she'd discovered in the general store, not the elaborate gown she'd once imagined for her wedding, but something that felt more truly herself than any expensive creation ever could. Jasper, bursting with importance in his role as ring-bearer, had polished his oversized boots to a mirror shine and slicked his copper hair down with enough pomade to build a small barn. Micah stood at the altar in his Sunday best, which wasn't much different from his everyday clothes except for the lack of horse smell and the addition of a string tie. When Cordelia walked down the short aisle on the arm of Dr. Henderson, the closest thing to a father figure the town could provide, Micah's face lit up with such joy that several of the church ladies dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Morrison, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness something miraculous, the joining of two hearts that found each other in the most unexpected way." As they spoke their vows, words of partnership and promise that they'd written together over the past week, Cordelia thought about the strange path that had led her here. If Beauregard Whitlock hadn't died, if Micah hadn't felt compelled to answer his correspondence, if Jasper hadn't been fishing near the train station that first day, none of this would have happened. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Morrison announced, beaming at the couple before him. When Micah's lips met hers, the little church erupted in cheers and applause. Somewhere in the front pew, Jasper was jumping up and down, shouting, "That's my mama now. That's my mama." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Cordelia had ever experienced. Tables appeared in the churchyard as if by magic, laden with dishes contributed by every family in town. A fiddle player struck up a lively tune, and soon couples were dancing on the grass while children ran between the tables and dogs begged for scraps. "Having second thoughts yet?" Micah asked as they stood watching Jasper attempt to teach the preacher's elderly dog to waltz. "Only about not doing this sooner," Cordelia replied, surprising herself with how easily the flirtation came as the sun began to set, painting the prairie sky in shades of gold and rose. The newlyweds found themselves sitting on a blanket at the edge of the celebration. Jasper curled up between them with his head in Cordelia's lap, finally exhausted by the day's excitement. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Micah said softly, testing out her new name. "I like the sound of that." "Good, because you're stuck with it now." He reached over to touch her hand, still marveling at the gold band that now circled her finger. "Any regrets about leaving Boston behind?" Cordelia looked around at the scene before them, their new neighbors cleaning up from the celebration, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, the child sleeping trustfully in her arms. Everything about this life was different from what she'd planned, rougher and simpler and infinitely more real than anything she'd known before. "My only regret," she said, "is that it took a dead man's letters to bring us together. Maybe that was just the universe's way of making sure we didn't miss each other," Micah suggested. A year later, when the railroad did indeed extend its line through Willowbrook, the Crenshaw family was ready. Their expanded business, part general store, part hotel, part livery stable, became the heart of the growing town. Cordelia proved to have an unexpected talent for managing the books and charming difficult customers, while Micah's reputation for honest dealing brought them customers from settlements 50 miles away. But their greatest success was measured, not in profits, but in the laughter that filled their expanded house, in Jasper's growing confidence as he adjusted to having a mother who read him stories and helped with his arithmetic, and in the quiet moments when Micah and Cordelia would sit on their front porch in the evenings, planning for the future and marveling at how perfectly their lives had intertwined. On their second wedding anniversary, as they stood on the same train platform where they'd first met, watching Jasper chase butterflies in the autumn sunshine, Cordelia reflected on how wrong she'd been about second chances. Sometimes, she'd learned, the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from embracing the unexpected twists that led you exactly where you were meant to be. "No regrets, Mrs. Crenshaw?" Micah asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. Cordelia smiled, watching their son, for Jasper was truly their son now, and thinking about the new baby she carried, the business they'd built together, and the love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. "None whatsoever, Mr. Crenshaw, none whatsoever." And as the afternoon train pulled away from Willowbrook Station, carrying new dreams and possibilities toward the horizon, the Crenshaw family walked home together, their story complete but their adventure just beginning.